Welcome, Tyler Moore from the University of Tulsa. He is a Tandy professor of cybersecurity and information assurance at the Tandy School of Computer Science at the University of Tulsa. He is also the director of the Security Economics Lab, and he serves as a faculty director of the Masters in Cybersecurity Online. Okay, and so he will be speaking to us today about the economics of cybersecurity. And so let's welcome Tyler Moore to speak to us.
Thanks, DJ. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to sit through a Zoom. I hope it's worth your time, but it's definitely an honor to get to speak with you. I'll have to do it again sometime when we can actually be down in Austin. But yeah, so I'm from one state north in Oklahoma, and even though I'm in a computer science department, my research sort of spans this interface between economics and computer science as it relates to cybersecurity. And my goal for today really is just to kind of talk through why I think an economic perspective is useful in understanding the problems in cybersecurity and what to do about it. So here's what I'm going to try to do. The talk is really going to split up into two parts. The first part is going to be about incentives and market failures. Essentially, I want to explain why cybersecurity is so hard. And there's a lot of simple, I think, economic explanations for why, even though we're spending all this money on cybersecurity, we still have these major failures. And then the second part of the talk will be looking at what might we do about it and do about these problems, informed by what we learned in the first part, what sort of interventions might work. So let's dive in. Now, we can start with a fairly simple concept. A computer system, a network system will often fail because the people in charge of that system, or the organization in charge of it, who could take a defensive precaution, they lack a sufficient incentive to do so. And let me start with an example of why. This one goes back a couple of decades, but it's still quite telling. So in the United States, we've kind of take for granted that whenever there is a payment card fraud of some kind, the banks are essentially on the hook for having to pay for that fraud. The onus is on the bank to show that the customer is somehow being negligent in order to not have to pay for fraud. And this has gone back this way since the early 1980s with regulations that require this. But there was a natural experiment in that there were other countries, notably the UK, that had a very similar technical infrastructure for the financial sector, similarly developed economy. However, what seemed to be different was the regulations, and instead of the default being placed on the bank to show that the customer was responsible for the fraud, it went the other way around. The customer had the onus to demonstrate if fraud occurred on their account that they weren't being negligent. And so these regulations made it easier for banks to sort of offload the responsibility of fraud to the customers.
Hey, Tyler,
so my question, yes.
Can you share your slides?
Well, there you go. That would be helpful, wouldn't it? Thank you. I shared my screen, but clearly I didn't. Well, you may be wondering, what am I talking about? Okay. Now can you see them? Can you see them?
Looks great. Perfect.
Okay. Well, okay, so this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. First of all, why things go wrong in security and how they can be fixed. And we're starting with incentives and the US versus UK banks. And so the question I'd put before you is which country suffered more fraud on a per capita basis? Turns out it was the United Kingdom, and this really comes down to the incentives that were at play. Because U.S. banks had to pay for the disputed transactions, they had a stronger incentive to actually make the investments in technology to reduce fraud, and we saw a much greater investment in anti-fraud efforts in the U.S. So, whereas in the UK, banks could blame customers for fraud, that dulled their incentive. They actually spent less money on trying to counter the fraud, and they experienced much higher rates of it. So that's kind of a nice beginning example of why the incentives matter and affecting how much of a insecure outcome you might have. Well, let's go to a more recent and current example, which would be the industrial control systems which control our critical infrastructure. So, our electric utilities, our water treatment, all of these critical infrastructure components, they are networked, but they have specialized networks, typically SCADA networks, that will control operations in those systems. And historically, these have been disconnected from the internet. So, and there's a good reason for that, because the systems are running protocols that are decades old, were never really designed for the kind of threat that we actually experience on the internet today. And often there are computers that will can program the behavior of these devices that get deployed in these very sensitive networks, and so you never want to have those connected to the internet. And that's sort of the best practice gold standard rule. And yet we know from experience that most of these networks are in fact connected to the internet. And this is an old picture from about 10 years ago, which showed sort of a geographic mapping of all these programmable logic controllers that should never have been connected to the internet, and all the ones that were. There's just a whole screen full of it. So what's going on here? Why is it that we know the best practice for cybersecurity in these systems is to not connect these devices to the internet, and yet the organizations choose to do so? Well, it comes back to the incentives at play. And so what you want to look at are the incentives of the different stakeholders. So you have the operators themselves, who definitely don't want their systems to be hacked, right? So they might want to not connect those devices to the internet. However, it's really costly to keep that physical separation of networks, and so there's a real pressure to not maintain two redundant different networks, one of which is an outdated protocol that's being used. The other fact is that empirically, if you look in the past, the likelihood of actually experiencing a cyber attack on one of these systems is very low. It's not quite zero, but it's pretty low, especially relative to all the other kinds of accidents and threats that these critical infrastructure operators must manage. And finally, the cost of an attack, were one to actually happen, is borne by society. It's borne by their customers, not the operators of these systems themselves. So if you just look at the critical infrastructure operators, it seems likely that maybe they're going to choose to want to connect. And so what about consumers? Well, you certainly don't want your electrical utility or your wastewater treatment plants to be attacked. But you also don't want to pay very much for your service. And critically, it's basically impossible to identify as an end user of one of these systems whether or not the utility has made a sufficient security investment. And so it's very difficult to choose and reward in the marketplace an adequate security investment by one of these players. Then we look at governments. Well, governments, they definitely don't want these utilities to be attacked. They will suffer the consequences when it does so. Just look at what happened with the Texas grid and with the natural disaster a couple months ago. Privately operated, yet the politicians bore a lot of the brunt of the blame when things went wrong. So there is definitely potential concern among politicians and civil servants about trying to do something about this. However, there's limited budget to often fund security, and even if you had the budget, there's often a lack of expertise on what needs to actually be done. And so, in a world in which you don't have regulation to compel certain behavior, the stakeholders are just going to follow their own interests. And in this case, what do? Well, the operators' incentives matter most because they're the ones that ultimately make the decision. And so, in this case, they're going to choose to tolerate a higher level of insecurity, to value the efficiency of running a single system that's connected to the internet that allows remote access. And so, we see this persistent vulnerability uh, carry on. So, there's another example. So that's a discussion about incentives, and now let's talk about two categories of market failure that I think really matter when we talk about cybersecurity. They're asymmetric information and externalities. So here's the classic market with asymmetric information: Texas auto sales, um, possibly in your state. But yeah, so why is a used car market one for with asymmetric information? Well, imagine you're a buyer. You want to go buy a used car, and you don't actually know whether or not the car you're buying has been well maintained, what its overall inherent quality is. Is it a cherry or a lemon? Well, um, you know, Akerlof won a Nobel Prize for characterizing what happens in markets like this. Um, and so let's say you have a town that's got 20 similar used cars for sale, same make and model and mileage on their face. On paper, they look the same. However, unobservable is this characteristic that, half the cars are cherries. They're in great condition, and their true value is about $20,000. By contrast, there are 10 lemons where that they look fine, but you drive them off the lot, they start leaking oil, and they're just going to be a money trap. And their true value is only $10,000 each. And so the question Akerlof posed and solved is, what is the market clearing price in this environment? And the um, answer is, well, it could be a couple things, right? So you might think, is it, $15,000? Maybe it's the average. Maybe it's 20,000. Maybe it's 10,000. Well, turns out the answer is $10,000. So it's the lower of the two true values. And why is that? Well, in this market, the buyers cannot determine the quality of the car. They can't tell if they're getting a lemon or a cherry. And as a result, they're not going to pay any premium. They're not going to pay $20,000 on the hope that they get a high quality version. Instead, they're just going to pay the lemon price because that's what they know they can get. But there's a feedback loop that goes on here, and that the sellers in turn know this. So the only people who are willing to sell their car are the owners of the lemons. And so the market gets flooded with lemons. Only the low quality car is the one you can buy. Now, I thought we were going to talk about cybersecurity. So what in the world am I doing wasting time talking about the used car market? Well, information asymmetries also plague cybersecurity markets. And they do it in two main ways. One, sort of the market for secure software and secure security services itself can be characterized as a market for lemons. The vendors, the people who develop the software and products, they may believe their software is secure. They may have gone through steps to make it secure. However, it's very hard for them to credibly communicate that to buyers. And if buyers don't believe that their software is any better than their competitors or any more secure than their competitors, they're not going to pay a premium for it. But again, we have this feedback loop that goes on. And so buyers in turn refuse to pay a premium for that secure software. So vendors aren't going to devote the resources to do so. So you end up with low quality, or it's not, you end up with software that prioritizes the kinds of things that can be observed. Things like the number of features that are offered, the usability of the software, its speed and performance, things that can be observed, and of course the price, right? Price tends to be observable, whereas security is not. The second area where information asymmetries keep cropping up is sort of the issues around availability of good data on what the cost of insecurity is, how much an attack might cost, how effective defenses are. And this is because we're in an environment where most firms who experience an attack are not going to talk about it unless they have a law that requires them to do so. And so it's only in sort of narrow cases, like in data breaches of personal information, do firms have an obligation to report that they've been attacked. And so we end up not knowing the true scope of what a threat is because people don't want to talk about it, which makes it hard to know before you've been attacked what the likelihood of being attacked is. And moreover, if you don't know what the true magnitude of the threat is, and you don't know whether or not a certain defense worked or not, it makes it really hard to spend rationally and invest rationally in your cyber defenses. You have to sort of guess that certain types of defenses are going to work, and you have to sort of have a sense of how likely it is that you're going to be attacked. Now, let me talk briefly about an example that is local to both you in Austin and me in Tulsa. This is Solarwinds, right? You probably talked about this at length, but Solarwinds was a company founded in Tulsa a little over 20 years ago. They at some point they decamped to Austin, and usually whenever we lose companies from Oklahoma to Texas, we're sad about it. But in this case, we were sad, but suddenly, as of last December, we became a little bit happier that Solarwinds decided to relocate. Because essentially SolarWinds unfortunately was the victim of sort of a very, very significant attack. Their software, which essentially was used by the vast majority of large corporations in the U.S. and many government agencies, was hacked. And this particular software is used to remotely administer critical IT services of enterprises. So, if you were trying to identify a piece of software that is maybe the most valuable for an attacker to target, the SolarWinds software would be kind of up there because it's embedded in systems that are mission critical to enterprises. And so often your mission critical network resources are those which are the most valuable to an attacker. And so anyway, so the SolarWinds software, turns out it had a number of very significant vulnerabilities and shoddy operational security practices that were uncovered. And so one question that sort of is prompted is like, why is it that such a key piece of software that is adopted by so many companies had such poor security? Well, it comes back to this information asymmetry. If you're a company or a government agency trying to decide if you want to use this product, it's really hard to figure out if the security of that product is very good or not. And it does so happen to be the case that SolarWinds is owned by a private equity company. And it is also the case that there's been some reporting that sort of suggests that they underinvested significantly in their security of their products, which you can get away with for some time, but eventually these things can lead to a devastating attack like we saw here. And so I think this is unfortunately a very prescient example of the consequences of information asymmetry on cybersecurity. Okay, so we've talked about incentives and asymmetric information. Let's talk about, excuse me, externalities. Our final explanation for why security is hard to do well. So we'll talk about two kinds of externalities, negative and positive. So this is the classic example of a negative externality, air pollution. This is, I believe, is a picture of Sao Paulo, where you see sort of smog in the horizon. And so an externality is essentially a, a negative externality, is a harm that happens as a harm that affects a third party that's not part of the original transaction. So let's say if you have a factory that produces widgets, and as a byproduct of making those widgets, you dump some sludge into the river. That pollution into the river is a negative externality, and if you don't price in the harm that is caused by that externality, then you're going to have an overproduction of the widget in this case, and so that's not good. So why am I talking about this to you today? Well, in many contexts, insecurity is also a negative externality. And the best example of this are botnets. So these are, computers that have been compromised, often at scale with thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of computers have been hacked, and then they're put under the control of an attacker. So in this case, it's the little masked bandit here who manages to install malware on these many computers. And then what makes it an externality here is that what happens next once the computer is hacked. It's not the case that computer is then just is harming the owner of that computer. Often what happens is in the case of a botnet is the botnet is then used to carry out attacks on a third party. So the classic example of this was email spam, and that's what this example shows here with this flood of envelopes. Basically, you have computers that are hacked, and each one will send out with some spare bandwidth email spam. And this is essentially how all email spam is transmitted today. And it's a negative externality because the sending out of email spam, doesn't affect the host. And in fact, for most botnets, the computers that are in a botnet, their owners have no idea because they're designed to not really affect the host. The harm is all supposed to be directed elsewhere, because as soon as the host knows that something's up and that there is a problem that affects them, they'll fix it. And so it's in the interest of the attacker to not actually harm the host and just instead use it to launch their attacks on third parties. But it's not just email spam. Another big example from a few years ago is the Mirai botnet. So you have all of these um, cameras, security cameras, which were IP based and used so that people could watch the outside of their home or business. And it turns out some of these security cameras were running insecure software, and if you could find them on the internet, you could try to log in with the default username and password. And if the password's been changed, well, if as soon as the camera is reset, every time the camera is reset, it will default back to the original username and password. And so attackers manage to scan the internet, excuse me, and find these cameras, hack them, and then, unbeknownst to the owner of the security camera, they used it to launch a denial of service attack on a large DNS provider, which ended up providing the DNS for Amazon, Twitter, all these big US companies. And so they launched this denial of service attack, which made the biggest internet platforms in the world come to their knees and not be able to work for the better part of a day or two. And so again, this is an externality because the owners of the cameras, they have no idea that they have been used in this way. One last externality example I'll point to is different than a botnet, but still quite important. And you think about the Equifax data breach. So it's been a few years, but one of the big three credit bureau essentially lost the credit bureau information of all of their customers, 143 million Americans. And so what happened here is, the technical details are kind of interesting, but not super relevant. It was just a web server that Equifax used that was running some open source software called Apache Struts, had an unpatched vulnerability. So a vulnerability that was known about for many months, but somehow Equifax didn't get around to patching. it was compromised, and then the attacker was able to then issue queries on that web server to get the credit files of 143 million Americans and do it in an undetected way for many months. And so this also, I would say, produced an externality. And so this is, I back when we could travel, I got the honor to go speak about this in Congress, and essentially I was talking about the harms that resulted from this data breach, and the harm that resulted here, in many ways exemplified this externality problem, in that the harm of a breach certainly didn't stick to just Equifax, right? So Equifax, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of fallout from their breach. Most of their C-suite got shown the door, and it was, they've definitely suffered a significant reputational damage. But even for all the harm Equifax experienced, the actual harm from this breach goes way beyond anything Equifax or its shareholders would have experienced. Instead, it affects all the 143 million Americans. It affects national security because we believe the nation state that was behind it can link that with information on previous breaches to potentially harm our national security by targeting people who have security clearances who also have maybe financial problems. And so we are essentially living with the harm that results from this, even to this day and beyond. And so um, the trouble is that Equifax as a company didn't fully appreciate the value that was at risk with that they were trying to protect against. The CEO of Equifax in this hearing before I spoke talked about how his company spent, the industry standard, industry average levels spent on IT security. And I think what that shows is that they didn't spend enough, because there are a few companies in the world who have more valuable assets than Equifax. And so in that environment where you're such a much higher value target to attackers, you should be spending a lot more on security than that. Well, in an environment where the harm isn't occurring directly to Equifax, but affecting you and me and the rest of society, it doesn't make sense for them to spend even more on security until it's too late. Okay, so let's talk about positive network externalities. And here, even though it's positive, it's actually not a good thing. So negative externalities is a harm that accrues to a third party as a result of somebody's actions. Well, positive externalities is a benefit. And we see this um, in the rise of online platforms, right? So we have a particular kind of externality called a network externality, where the value of a network or a platform grows as more users participate in that platform. So this produces big first mover advantage. So and we see these platforms everywhere in the online space through social networks, operating systems, you name it. And so because these platforms become more valuable as more people use it, there are some significant implications for security, which is, first of all, it pays to be first to market, right? You want your product out there. And if to the extent that making your product secure inhibits your ability to become the dominant platform, you shouldn't be paying it. You're a fool to pay attention to it. And so often what you see is security only becomes a consideration once the dominant position is reached, right? So, it took Microsoft 20 years to actually take security seriously. It took them 20 years and a 90% plus market share, and lots of embarrassments with Windows XP to realize, okay, that it was worth making the investment in security now that they have this dominant position. The challenge, of course, it's very hard to actually add security in after the fact. And so you just continue to see problems with it today. The other big problem with dominant platforms, you have this correlated risk. An attack on a single platform can have such a broader overall impact. So, the takeaway about externalities is, if you have a positive externality, you have less of the good than you would like. with negative externality, you have more of the bad. So let me pivot to the next part of the talk, I've essentially, in the first part we've talked about to now is sort of why I think there are economic arguments for cybersecurity being so hard, and why we see the sorry state of cybersecurity that exists today. And then the back half of this talk, I'm going to try to be a little more optimistic and think about what we can do about it. Knowing that we have problems with asymmetric information, with externalities and misaligned incentives. What can be done? And so we're going to talk about certification schemes, information disclosure, and some voluntary things like insurance. So when you have an information asymmetry, like we saw with the used car market, like say in the case of secure software, if you're a large buyer of that software, say the Department of Defense, you have a vested interest in trying to ensure that you get the secure product, right? And so one way to try to deal with that is to develop a certifier who can actually have the expert knowledge to do the evaluation to make sure that things are actually, say, secure in this case. And so, and then you can use that as a signal of quality that others can interpret and then reward in the marketplace. And so this is not a new idea. There's this thing called, informally called the Orange Book, because it looks like this. And it's a series of rules where you can evaluate the security of software products and that are provided by the DoD. And this is quite useful. It is quite expensive, and unfortunately, it can also the certification schemes themselves can be gamed, right? And so, in many cases, the evaluation gets paid for by the vendor who's seeking approval, which can cause all kinds of issues. The one example I'll point to here is this is a pin entry device. So for an EMV or chip-based payment card, this one is from the United Kingdom, and this pin entry device was evaluated by the common criteria because it was important to ensure that this device be tamper evident. So you don't want anyone to be able to tap into the hardware here to be able to observe the pins as they're entered on the terminal. And so one of the requirements was that it needed to be common criteria evaluated. It was. However, it turns out, despite this evaluation, it was insecure. And it's a little hard to see here, but there's this little wire right here is actually a paper clip. And this paper clip stuck just in the right spot in the back of this device was actually used successfully to read off the pin for that was entered here, and do so in a way that could not be detected as being tampered with. So essentially, the certification failed. And there was a bit of a postmortem as to why, and it turned out that the incentives around certification were all screwed up. The company behind this, Ingenico, was able to just shop around for the outfit that would provide the common criteria evaluation without really doing much of a rigorous test in the first place. So certification schemes can help, but they're really hard to get right. So they're far from a panacea. Another quick example of a certification scheme is, let's look here. Whenever you're trying to search for anything on the internet, how do you know if the search results are, the websites you visit are actually legitimate or not? You'd like to think maybe because Google, has chose to put one of these websites over the top, it's probably more trustworthy. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not a very reliable thing to do, because some of these sites here, when I search for these shoes, and Amazon, Zappos, that's good, but then there's also these sites you've never heard of: mbtshoestar.com, Footwear TC, MBT Sports Sale. You look behind these sites, they're actually quite different. Zappos has these seals from the Better Business Bureau. They are secure. The seal is in one of these certification schemes to indicate trustworthiness. Turns out MBT Sports Sale also has some seals, or it looks like they do, but actually, if you look at their information, this website is registered to a person named Joe Susan in Fujian province in China. So it turns out, sorry, my screen seems to be having a mind of its own right now. It turns out that these seals didn't actually help very much. And there was a nice study looking at trustee, which actually showed that this was an endemic problem. Um, so essentially, what happened here is trustee will certify websites. It was actually one of the very first to do this. And what Edelman found was that trustee certifications were actually worse than useless. There was something called adverse selection at play, where the websites that were actively bad, that were malicious in terms of trying to harm you if you visited them, you're more than twice as likely for a trustee certified site to be malicious than a general population of sites. And so what this tells you is that you can have one of these signaling devices, but if it's not implemented well, it's going to be gamed by the attackers. And so, um, yeah, again, my point is that if you're going to think about a way of overcoming information asymmetries, you can consider these seals or certifications, but you must be careful and not expect them to work completely. Information disclosure. So this is an area in which I would say we've seen probably the most real world progress in terms of cybersecurity policy interventions. So Louis Brandeis, the famous Supreme Court justice, was sort of the godfather of the transparency movement. He coined this phrase that sunlight's the best of disinfectants. And often we know that cybersecurity incidents are hidden from view. So one way to try to deal with this from a policy perspective is to mandate disclosure of an incident when it occurs. And we actually have that for data breaches, and we've had it for a long time. And it started in California in 2002, so almost 20 years ago. And it was in this I would say almost a Trojan horse introduced by Deirdre Mulligan, who's now as a law professor at the iSchool in Berkeley. She managed to add into this bill in the California legislature that anyone who is doing business in California, if you breach the personal information of a California resident, you had to notify. And she actually modeled this on something called the toxic release inventory from the EPA. But she had this idea. She took it to this legislator she was working with. There was no interest in it. And then there was a data breach of California state employees. And so they came back and said, hey, you have this bill to deal with that. And so she said, yeah, yeah. And then they passed it into law. So the legislators suddenly were interested when it was their information that had been breached. But little did they know, this ended up setting off a whole range of laws. We have these laws now in nearly every state and in the European Union. And we know more about data breaches than we do essentially any other form of security threat because of this California law, which first led to this disclosure from a company called ChoicePoint. Then the floodgates opened. So essentially, we've heard about it for years, and we now, I would say, we manage data breaches probably better than we do any other cybersecurity threat because it's top of mind to many organizations because we all know about its true prevalence now. So the general lesson here, I think, is that most cybersecurity risk, I think, can be managed if we can measure it appropriately and assign responsibility for failure. So in this case, we now can better measure the prevalence of data breaches, and the obligation is also quite clear, right? So there is a requirement to disclose the harm to the affected citizen, and that's kind of the extent of it. You might be upset that there isn't more liability or other responsibility, but it turns out just making that assignment has made a lot of change come to pass. And I would say it is no coincidence that when you look at cyber insurance, which we'll talk about in a minute, the most mature market for cyber insurance coverage relates to data breach. Because we now have these laws which require disclosures of data breach incidents, this is in effect created the market for insuring against that risk. Whereas without that obligation to disclose, we don't have the knowledge of its prevalence. The risk is largely uninsurable. Excuse me. And you could apply the same principle in other areas where we don't have mandatory disclosure, things like financial fraud, um, cyber espionage incidents. So theft of intellectual property is often stated as a huge threat, of that. But the fact is, we can't point to very many concrete examples of it happening because they tend to be classified, or companies don't want to talk, or maybe there just isn't that much of it. We don't know because we don't have a good measure of the actual historical prevalence. Control systems incidents, again, industrial control systems, they are often insecure. We worry about about an attack, but we only hear about attacks, maybe once or twice a year at most. And essentially, what we need, I think, are better collection of dealing with the overall losses attributed to cybercrime. And it's not the case that in all instances this information has to be made public in order to be effective. I think that is a possibility, like we have with data breaches, but you could also just end up disclosing to regulators, just disclosing in a way that could lead to aggregated reporting, maybe not public reporting. But there's a lot of opportunity here, but unfortunately, we haven't made much progress beyond data breach to this point. So the last thing I want to talk about before I get questions from you is briefly what kind of voluntary measures can be done to try to correct some of these problems. And so, there are some benefits to taking a voluntary approach, but there are natural limits too. Most of the regulatory efforts in cybersecurity have been voluntary to adopt, not all, but you have things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, which sets out sort of this process for being able to manage the cyber risk within an organization in a structured way. This is a voluntary process. However, firms that do it, they do see benefits. One is, in addition to their own security, they have a nice defense against any negligence claims that might result if a breach were to occur. Information sharing has been quite successful. This was really started in the late 90s as a way for different critical infrastructures to share information amongst themselves, sort of facilitated by the government. So the government plays a coordinating role of voluntary participation. We also see there was legislation called the Cyber Information Sharing Act, I think, which made it easier for firms to share cyber data with the government by providing some liability disclaimers and so forth. I think that's been a lot less successful than the ISAC model. Firms seem to be a lot more willing to share with each other than with the government. And there have been other attempts by DHS to try to pool cyber incident information. My takeaway from a lot of this is that governments can play a very valuable coordinating role in trying to bring different parties together, because there are quite a few coordination problems and challenges in cybersecurity. But it's not going to deal fundamentally with a misalignment of incentives. It's not going to fundamentally deal with externalities or even some information asymmetries. And so it's at best a partial solution, but it's one that is one that you can carry out without requiring legislative action. So in my remaining couple of minutes, I just want to talk about cyber insurance before I open this up to questions, because cyber insurance is often put forth as a possible private solution to the governance issues that exist in cybersecurity, right? So, and here's a nice quote which I think encapsulates what we can see. So, in the future, the computer security industry will be run by the insurance industry, I don't mean insurance companies will sell firewalls, but the kind of firewall you use, authentication, network monitoring you use will be strongly influenced by the constraints of insurance. So this is an interesting idea for the future. What's maybe a little bit surprising is that Bruce Schneier, who's a sort of leading thinker in cybersecurity, he first posed this in 2001. So it's been 20 years since this was put forth as a possible solution to the challenges in cybersecurity. So why is it that this has been so appealing? Well, um, you can go back to the Great Chicago Fire in the late 1800s. You know, Chicago was this growing city and didn't have strong fire codes, really any at all. So they had these buildings made of wood, and they all burned in 1871. 300 people died, 2,000 acres burned, over 100,000 left homeless. Sad story, but you know, it's in America. We get up by our bootstraps and we rebuild. Only problem was there was a second Chicago fire in 1874, 3 years later, and burned you know, at a smaller scale, but it still killed quite a few people and caused a lot of damage. This time, the fire insurance industry responded and basically imposed codes that had to be followed in order to be able to obtain any insurance moving forward. And so the insurance industry essentially said, you have to do these things to get your house in order. Otherwise, we're not going to insure you. And so the question is, could the insurance industry do the same thing for cyber? Could you say, we will not insure you unless you make these certain baseline investments in cybersecurity? Um, it's an interesting idea, you know, and there are some merits to it. You know, I think, you know, we have seen that insurers do help after a breach has occurred, making the harm of the breach not worse by coordinating post-breach services. Um, and they do try to influence behavior before a breach happens, but they've been a lot less success there, right? So there have been attempts to say you should adopt basic hygiene, and then there's also a certification scheme where you could sort of say these are the good controls you should adopt. Um, but again, insurance is not a panacea. I mean, the trouble is that insurers struggle to differentiate good cyber risk from bad. They're not in a position right now to tell us which security controls, which defenses work better than others. Um, and more fundamentally, uh, their influence over firms is limited. You could say, hey, we'll give you a discount if you adopt these cyber security controls, but the discount you would receive is often dwarfed by the cost of actually adopting that mitigation. So cybersecurity is expensive to adopt within an organization, and any savings in your premium is going to be smaller, often by many multiples than what the costs are of the mitigation itself. And then finally, firms often don't want to file claims because they often worry most about the reputational damage that could occur, um, and you know, damage to reputation is not insurable. And finally, there's some evidence that there are, you know, the risk assessment that underwriters take on firms is not great because there's a very strong pressure to try to acquire more business. And so essentially, you know, cyber insurance could still be a way forward, but it's again partial at best. I think we see lots of partial solutions, but we just have to work within knowledge of their limitations. So to wrap up, you know, if you take one thing from this talk, it's that, you know, misaligned incentives really affect the challenges we face in cybersecurity. Information asymmetries, externalities, you know, these are nice economic explanations for why security is hard and why needs to be a strong policy role in making cybersecurity better for society. And it's both policies and technologies that are going to make measurement easier, that will sustainably improve security. And with that, I will pause and use the remaining time for any questions that you may have. Thanks for your attention.
Tyler, thank you. We do have one question that we want to answer real quick. So, do you know of any proposed legislation requiring companies to remove sensitive data once they no longer have a business relationship with a customer?
Good question. So, um, yeah, I think the closest thing we have really has to do with more with data privacy legislation. So I didn't talk about it today, but in the European Union, there's something called the GDPR, um, and in the and again in California, California has something called the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which in many ways is modeled after the GDPR. What this legislate both of these kinds of legislation try to do is they try to limit the extent to which you collect information, um, and keep personal information, um, to only when you have a clear business purpose. And in the language of the GDPR, it needs to be proportionate. And in both the CCPA and the GDPR, there's a right to be forgotten. And so there is a consumer right that's built in to where they can request that you would remove all information that you have about them. So, um, you know, if you are in a company that has any customers who are European Union subjects, then you are sort of stuck in dealing with them with the GDPR. So you might think, oh, it's as long as we don't have a business presence there, we're fine. In fact, that used to be the case with the data protection regulation, but the GDPR eliminated that carve out, and now essentially, so long as you're affecting European citizens, you have European citizens as customers, you are potentially covered. And even if you're all right there, California does the same trick, in the sense that if you have California customers among a certain exceeding a certain number, then you're sort of in its hooks. I see there's another question. So from Steven, do you think the latest ransomware attack at CNA will affect the market given risk to insured clients who have made information breach in this attack? Yeah, so ransomware is interesting. And, you know, yeah, and this particular case at CNA is especially challenging because it's a ransomware at an insurer, right? So ransomware is already causing significant problems for the cyber insurance industry, right? Because it's one of these things that really was not on the radar, didn't really happen at all. And then there was a spit of it in 2017, then it shot through the roof in 2018, and it's flared a little bit back and forth, but it's a really big problem. And like data breach, it's something that is it's kind of straightforward to observe, and it's the kind of thing that's happening at a scale that it affects many companies. So even before you look at what affected the insurer itself, they were very worried about correlated risk, because essentially every organization is vulnerable to ransomware, and so it's really hard to um, manage that risk. And so I think to me there's a couple of interesting steps here that could go forward. One is we have this issue around norms of whether you pay the ransom or not, right? So with the insurance market now, I mean, one of the key parts of the coverage is they will pay the ransom for you, right? And so um, on an individual victim basis, that makes sense. But you can ask yourself whether maybe game theoretically, if you sort of look at the long term, if you use it as an iterative game, does it actually make sense to do that? And what we've seen is an escalation in the size and frequency of ransoms that are elicited. And so I think what that really calls for is some coordination in trying to not pay the ransoms. You look at the markets for um, kidnap and ransom insurance, that it works totally differently, in that the insurers actually work together to keep the ransoms that they pay down. And that's a key part of the strategy to reduce the overall prevalence of kidnap and extortion ransom. And so I think going forward, we're going to have to consider some of that. Okay, so Brandon asked, do you see any economic principles on the horizon that could help shape cybersecurity for the better? Yeah, so let's try to be optimistic here. Um, yeah, I think that's reasonable. Um, I mean, I think that the to the extent that we can, um, to the extent that we can provide better quantification and measurement of risk here, I think we could actually make significant improvements, right? And so it's just that right now we're in a world in which the equilibrium is that it's not in people's interest to actually do good risk quantification. If you're in the cybersecurity industry, there's not, people are buying your products. If you maybe the last thing you want is better evaluation of their functionality. um, I really see that. I think that the sort of one untapped coordinating role that I think a government can make is to provide better data and available to the private sector on cybersecurity risks, right? So if for a relatively low cost, you could imagine a public sector effort to start systematically tracking things like cybersecurity incidents, like investment in certain broad classes of controls in different industries. And if you make that data available in a consistent way to the private sector, I think that could actually unleash a lot of innovation. It's just we need that coordination that isn't there. So I'm optimistic if we do that, that we could actually end up in a much better place than we are.
So
Okay, Jaime, is there a current proposal to impose a cost on companies that collect massive amounts of data? Well, yeah, I mean, this is one of the challenges, right? Is that we never really have we still don't have clarity on who owns personal data. I mean, to the extent that we have clarity, is that the company who collects it gets to own it, not the person, right? Which um, means that there is a strong incentive to keep collecting the data, right? I mean, the one thing that would be a potential pushback and introduction of cost is if things like the CCPA spread, because essentially they are imposing an implicit cost because you are essentially now having to do additional forms of compliance and additional justification that it is worth you collecting this data. And if you lose the data, then you have all these obligations that you didn't previously have. And so I think there have been some examples of um, organizations looking at things like CCPA obligations and deciding that it's not worth keeping as much data as they once had. So having a practice of deleting personal data that's no longer have of business value. So I think in some sense that may be your best way forward.
all right, and another question is, as this is an interdisciplinary thing, right? We're moving
Mm-hmm.
between computer science and these technical issues, engineering, and also between more of what we call like soft sciences, is social sciences
Yep.
with economics and with sociology and these other. How do we train for these? How do we read these? How do we do these either as students or as academics or in the business world? How do we combine these?
Yeah. Well, it's a challenge. I mean, to me, the interfaces between disciplines is generally the most fruitful area for research, right? At the interface is often very good. Um, but also it just so happens that cybersecurity in particular is so interdisciplinary in that, right? In that it affects people and organizations and everyone, right? And so many different disciplines have a role to play in sort of in understanding the solution, designing that, whether it's designing the tech or designing it in a way that actually reflects, how people operate. So yeah, I mean, what we're trying to do in Tulsa, in terms of the education front, is we're setting up an interdisciplinary school of cyber studies where it's going to we're setting up our degree programs outside of, say, the computer science department, and we're appointing faculty from across the university, from computer science to business to psychology, economics, to each lend their disciplinary perspective, and then work together to produce a naturally an interdisciplinary degree program. And it's a little bit hard because we naturally want to specialize in our own disciplines, but I think that for us to be effective in cybersecurity going forward, we kind of have to overcome that. It's a challenge on the research side, but in some sense, research is and it's probably the least of a challenge, in some sense, in business, because in business and industry, you just want to make things work, right? And so you kind of don't care about this. But in academia, we like to organize ourselves and into our own little fiefdoms, and so we have to overcome some of that. It's maybe your first step is to fight it at the research level, and then maybe eventually push it out into the how we train the people who are going to be fixing these problems as we go forward.
Tyler, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much.